The Vorthak warcruiser Dominions will hung in the void like a blade poised to strike, its brutalist silver-purple hull bristling with weapon nodes that pulsed with harsh violet energy. Commander Vorgel stood at the center of the command nexus, his armored fingers tracing the holographic projection of the human colony below. A fragile cluster of domes and spires clinging to the irradiated surface of a dying world. The thought slithered through his mind as he studied the settlement. No orbital defenses, no fleet presence, just a handful of primitive structures, their alloy plating pitted by cosmic debris. The Vorthak had crushed 100 such worlds before, species that cowered when faced with the might of the Empire. Scan complete, Commander. Gromnock rasped from the analysis terminal, his voice a grating hum of modulated harmonics. The scientist's four, jointed fingers danced across the console, pulling up data streams in jagged Vorthak script. Minimal energy signatures, no military-grade shielding. Their technology is crude. Vorgel's mandibles twitched in amusement. The humans had barely reached the stars, their ships slow and lumbering compared to the Empire's swift destroyers. They were insects, and insects were meant to be crushed. Open a channel, he commanded. The holodisplay flickered, resolving into the image of a human female, Colonel Caroline Keller, according to their intelligence. Her face was lined with exhaustion, her uniform frayed at the edges, but her gaze was steady, unbroken. Vorgel found that irritating. Human Commander, he intoned, the translation matrix flattening his voice into cold metallic syllables. Your world is now property of the Vorthak Dominion. Surrender your infrastructure, disband your military, and submit to imperial governance. Resistance will be met with annihilation. He expected fear, begging, the desperate bargaining of a species that knew it stood on the brink of extinction. Instead, Keller smiled. It was a small thing, barely a twitch of her lips. But it carried something dark, something knowing. Commander Vorgel, she said, her voice calm. You don't understand what you're doing. The transmission cut. Silence filled the bridge. Gromnock's claws clicked against the console, his sensory spines flaring in agitation. They refuse. Vorgel's grip tightened on the edge of the holodisplay. He had seen it before. Foolish species clinging to pride even as their worlds burned. Target their primary habitation dome, he ordered. Reduce it to slag. The weapons officer hesitated. Commander, our scans indicate non-combatants. The Dominions will shudder as its primary plasma lances charged, violet energy coiling like serpents, before lashing out in a searing beam. The strike would obliterate the dome in an instant, leaving nothing but molten glass and ash. But the beam never struck. A shimmering barrier flared to life above the colony, a hexagonal lattice of golden light that swallowed the plasma blast whole. The energy dissipated harmlessly, scattering into harmless auroras. Gromnock's spine stood rigid. That's impossible. Our scans detected no shield generators. Vorgel's blood ran cold, because now the humans were laughing, and deep in the void beyond the planet, something stirred. The holodisplay flickered, casting jagged violet reflections across the Dominion's wills. Command deck. Vorgel's claws flexed against the armrest of his throne. The alloy groaning under the pressure. That golden shield, that impossible shield, should not exist. His warriors shifted uneasily, their spines twitching in agitation. The humans below stood unharmed, their laughter a silent taunt carried over the comms. Gromnock's talons danced across his console, frantically recalibrating the ship sensors. Commander, the shield isn't projected from the surface. His voice faltered. It's orbital. Vorgel's gaze snapped upward. Beyond the planet's curvature, where the void should have been empty, something moved. At first, it was nothing more than a distortion, a ripple in the black. Then, like a predator shedding camouflage, the human warship unfolded. It was monstrous, not in the way of Vorthak design, all brutal edges and weaponized symmetry. No, this vessel was a relic of war, its hull a patchwork of scarred armor plates, each bearing the marks of past battles. Railgun batteries bristled along its spine, their barrels still warm from recent firing solutions. And at its heart, a reactor pulsed with a deep amber glow, like the last embers of a dying fire. Gromnock's breath hissed through his teeth. That's the Indomitable. Vorgil finished, the name tasting like ash. He had heard the reports, a ghost ship, they called it, a legend whispered in the ruins of conquered systems, the last remnant of a human fleet that refused to die, and now it was here. The Indomitable didn't hail them, didn't demand surrender. It simply turned, aligning its broadside with the Dominion's, will in a gesture so deliberate it bordered on contempt. Vorgil's warriors braced. Then the void screamed. Railgun slugs tore through space, their hypersonic passage igniting the thin exosphere into brief, violent flares. The Dominion's will shuddered as its shields flared silver, purple under the onslaught, buckling under kinetic force alone. Gromnock's voice was a strangled rasp. They're not using energy weapons, just metal. Vorgil's blood burned. This wasn't warfare as the galaxy understood it. No elegant plasma lances, no calculated ion bursts. This was brutality distilled raw, unrefined, and devastatingly effective. And the humans weren't done. Deep within the Indomitable's belly, something awoke. A low, resonant hum shuddered through the comms, vibrating through the bones of every Vorthak on the bridge. Then, light. A beam of molten gold lanced out, not from a cannon, but from the ship's very hull, as though the vessel itself had become the weapon. It struck the Dominion's will's shields, and for a single horrifying second, the barrier held. Then it shattered. The beam carved through armor like a blade through flesh, searing deep into the ship's superstructure. Alerts blared, systems failed, and for the first time in his long, merciless career, Vorgil felt something unfamiliar coil in his gut. Because the humans weren't just fighting, they were teaching, and the lesson had only just begun. The molten gold beam faded, leaving behind a wound in the Dominion's will that pulsed with residual heat, the edges of the breach glowing like embers in the void. Vorgil's claws dug into the command console, his silver-purple armor reflecting the emergency lights flickering across the bridge. His secondary heart pounded, an instinctive primal response to a predator's strike. This was not war as the Vorthak waged it. Their empire had risen on calculated annihilation, on fleets that crushed resistance before it could form. They broke worlds not with savagery, but with precision. Each conquest a clinical dissection of enemy forces, leaving no room for defiance. Yet the humans fought like cornered beasts. No worse, like hunters. Gromnock, his scientist's mind whirring even in crisis, analyzed the damage reports. The beam had bypassed shield harmonics entirely, its energy signature unlike anything in the Vorthak archives. Not plasma, not kinetics. Something older, his neural interface flickered with warnings. The human ship's power core pulsed again, that same deep, resonant hum vibrating through the comms. They were charging another shot. Vorgil snarled, his voice cutting through the chaos. Evasive pattern Zeta. 9 all batteries return fire. The Dominion's will shuddered as its remaining cannons unleashed a storm of silver-purple lances, each bolt designed to cripple a warship's systems in a single strike. They rained against the Indomitable's hull and splintered. The human vessel didn't just absorb the barrage. It ignored it. Gromnock's crest of spines flattened in disbelief. Their armor, it's adapting. Scans revealed the truth. The outer plating rippled where the energy strikes landed, its molecular structure shifting, dispersing the impact like water parting around a blade. It wasn't a shield. It wasn't even armor in the traditional sense. It was alive. Somehow, the humans had weaponized healing. Vorgil's mandibles twitched. This was impossible. No species could engineer such technology without centuries of advancement, unless they had needed it sooner. unless they had faced extinction and clawed their way back. A new alert blared. The Indomitable was moving, not retreating, but closing the distance. On the view screen, the human warship's prow split open, revealing rows of jagged, barbed structures that glowed with the same molten gold energy. The Indomitable rammed them. Metal screamed. The impact sent Vorthak warriors sprawling, their exoskeletons cracking against bulkheads. The Dominions were listed, its structural integrity failing, where the human ship had embedded itself like a blade in flesh. Vorgil staggered, his vision swimming. Through the smoke and sparks, he saw them. Human boarding pods, and they weren't empty. The first hatch exploded inward, and the shadows inside moved. Gromnock's breath caught. The creatures that emerged were not soldiers. They were scars given form, augmented, relentless, and very, very angry. The lesson continued. The boarding pods had not disgorged soldiers, not in the way the Vorthak understood them. These were something else. Gromnock's data. Slate slipped from his claws, clattering against the deck as the first of the humans stepped into the flickering emergency lights of the Dominion's will. The figure was encased in armor, but not the sleek, polished plating of Vorthak shock troops. This was forged armor, hammered and scarred, its surface etched with kill, markings and crude, jagged sigils. The helmet was a snarling visage, its optics burning like embers in the dark. And then it moved. The human crossed the distance before the Vorthak sentries could raise their plasma casters. A blade, monomolecular, humming with suppressed energy, flashed once. Two warriors collapsed. Their carapaces split open like brittle husks. Gromnock's secondary heart stuttered. This was not combat. This was butchery. More figures poured from the ruptured pods, each one a nightmare variation of the last. Some were hulking brutes, their limbs reinforced with hydraulic augmetics that hissed with every step. Others were lean, their armor woven with stealth systems that made them flicker in and out of visibility. A few carried weapons the Vorthak had no name for. Crackling whips of plasma, rotary cannons fed by backpack reactors, rifles that pulsed instead of firing, sending shockwaves through the air that liquefied organs. Vorgil roared orders, his mandibles flaring in fury. His warriors responded, forming a defensive line, their plasma casters spitting violet death. It did not matter. The humans walked through it. Their armor absorbed the blasts, dispersing the energy across honeycombed layers of ablative plating. One warrior, taller than the rest, his pauldrons marked with crimson slashes, took a direct hit to the chest. The plasma scorched his breastplate black, but he did not stagger. He laughed, a deep, grating sound that vibrated through the deck. Then he charged. Gromnock's mind raced, his scientific detachment crumbling under the weight of what he was witnessing. The humans were not just surviving the Vorthak's weapons, they were ignoring them. Their armor, their augments, their physiology, all of it was wrong. No species evolved like this. No species bred like this. A new horror dawned in his mind. Unless they had needed to, the warrior with the crimson slashes reached the Vorthak line. His fist, encased in a powered gauntlet, struck the nearest warrior in the thorax. The impact did not just crack the carapace. It detonated the warrior from within, sending chitinous shrapnel spraying across the corridor. Gromnock's data slate had been analyzing the humans since they boarded. Now, it finally returned a result. He stared at the readout, his blood running cold. The humans were not just augmented, they were optimized. Every muscle fiber reinforced, every bone laced with shock, absorbing alloys. Neural enhancements that reduced reaction times to near instantaneous. Their blood carried nanites that sealed wounds before they could bleed out. Their very DNA had been rewritten, spliced with strands of something ancient and predatory. This was not the work of a young species. This was the work of a species that had stared into the abyss and clawed its way back. A hand seized Gromnock's arm. He turned, expecting another human. Instead, it was Vorgil, The commander's exoskeleton was cracked, his primary arm hanging limp, leaking ichor. His remaining eye burned with something Gromnak had never seen in a Vorthak before. "Fall back," Vorgil snarled. "Fall back to the secondary bulkhead." Now, Gromnak did not argue. As they retreated, he cast one last glance over his shoulder. The humans were not pursuing, they were waiting. And in the shadows behind them, something larger stirred. The lesson was not over. The secondary bulkhead sealed behind them with a hiss of pressurized hydraulics, the reinforced alloy doors locking into place with a finality that did nothing to ease the tension coiling in Gromnak's thorax. The command center beyond was a dimly lit cavern of flickering tactical displays, their silver-purple luminescence casting jagged shadows across the faces of the remaining Vorthak warriors. The air smelled of scorched metal and the acrid tang of spilled coolant, familiar sense of war, yet now laced with something new. Vorgil staggered to the central holotable, his damaged exoskeleton whining in protest. His mandibles twitched as he activated the security feeds, the screens flickering to life with static-laced images of the corridors they had just fled. The humans had not followed, not yet. Gromnak's secondary eyes darted across the displays, his neural interface parsing the data in rapid bursts. The humans had let them retreat. That was the unsettling truth. They had cut through the first line of defense, like a blade through weak flesh, yet now they lingered, methodical, deliberate, as if they were savoring the hunt. A low vibration thrummed through the deck plating. Gromnak's spines flared. "They're moving." Vorgil's remaining eye narrowed, "Not toward us." The feeds shifted, zooming in on the human soldiers. They were spreading out, securing intersections, but their movements were not those of invaders clearing a path. They were searching for something. Then the camera feed from Sector Faye flickered and died. A second later, another, then another. Gromnak's neural interface screamed a warning as the last functioning feed in the sector flared with sudden violent light. A human stood at its center, clad in armor that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. In their hands was a weapon Gromnak had never seen before, a long segmented device that hummed with a sound like a dying star. The human turned, as if sensing the camera's gaze, and then the feed cut to black. Vorgil's claws dug into the holotable, leaving furrows in the metal. What in the void was that? Gromnak's mind raced. The humans had not just come to fight. They had come to send a message, and the message was written in the bones of their own history. Somewhere deep in the ship, something detonated. The blast was muffled, distant, but the tremor that followed was unmistakable. The lights flickered, and for a heartbeat, the command center was plunged into darkness. When the emergency luminescence flared back to life, the tactical displays were flashing red. Sector Faye was gone, not breached, not overrun. Gromnak's mandibles clicked in disbelief. The humans had weapons that could unmake matter, and they had waited until now to use them. Vorgil's voice was a ragged growl. "They're not just killing us, they're teaching us." Gromnak understood then. This was not a battle. It was a demonstration, and the lesson was far from over. The silence that followed the detonation was worse than the blast itself. Gromnak's neural tendrils pulsed with erratic energy, his mind struggling to process the impossible. The humans had not merely destroyed Sector Faye, they had unwoven it. The structural integrity scans showed nothing but a perfect void where the corridor had once been, as if reality itself had been snipped away by some unseen hand. Vorgil's claws flexed, his armored plates vibrating with suppressed fury. His instincts screamed at him to retaliate, to crush these insolent creatures beneath the might of the Vorthak war machine. But something deeper, something primal, whispered a warning. The humans had known exactly where to strike. Gromnak's secondary eyes flickered as he accessed the ship's damaged databanks. The humans had not just breached their defenses, they had studied them. Every attack, every incursion had been surgical. They had mapped the Stormclaw's weak points, its redundancies, its blind spots, and now they were exploiting them with terrifying precision. A new alert blared across the command nexus. The human boarding pods, those crude, primitive-looking capsules they had dismissed as laughable, had not been empty. They had been Trojan horses. Gromnock's mandibles twitched as the security feeds flickered to life, displaying the carnage unfolding in the lower decks. The humans moved like shadows, their armor absorbing the harsh silver-purple glow of Vorthak luminescence. Their weapons were not the crude ballistics the Vorthak had expected. They were adaptive. Plasma rounds shifted mid-flight, adjusting trajectory to bypass shielding. Kinetic slugs shattered into flechettes shredding through armor like paper. And then there were the blades, monomolecular edges that hummed with a sound like a dying star, slicing through Vorthak alloy as if it were flesh. But worse than their weapons was their silence. No battle cries, no taunts. Just the relentless, methodical advance of predators who had spent millennia perfecting the art of war. Vorgel snarled, his voice a guttural rasp. They are not soldiers, they are hunters. Gromnock's neural tendrils coiled tight. He had seen the records of human history, their wars, their genocides, their endless cycles of destruction and rebirth. He had dismissed them as barbaric, chaotic. But now he understood, chaos was not their weakness. It was their weapon, and the Vorthak had just awakened it. Somewhere in the darkness of the ship, another detonation rumbled. The lesson was far from over. The command deck flickered under the assault of human weaponry, silver-purple emergency lighting, casting jagged shadows across the Vorthak officers. Vorgel's claws flexed against the tactical display, the holographic projection distorting as another EMP surge rippled through the ship's systems. The humans weren't just attacking their hull, they were dismantling their understanding of war. Gromnock's neural tendrils twitched as he processed the flood of sensor data. His initial scans had dismissed human vessels as crude, their technology a patchwork of stolen concepts and brute force engineering. But now, as their systems bled into the Vorthak networks like a virus, he saw the truth. Humanity had not stolen technology. They had consumed it. Their electronic warfare protocols moved like living things, adaptive, relentless, rewriting themselves in real time to bypass firewalls. Encryption shattered under the weight of fractal algorithms, their origins indecipherable, their logic alien even to the Vorthak's most advanced decryption suites. Gromnock watched in horror as entire databanks dissolved into static, replaced by flickering human sigils, ancient symbols of war, conquest, defiance. They left us a message, not in words. In weapons, a proximity alert screamed. Another boarding pod had latched onto the hull, its magnetic clamps burrowing through armor like parasites. The Vorthak had expected boarding actions to be desperate, chaotic charges. Instead, the humans moved with surgical precision. Thermal scans showed their soldiers advancing in perfect sync, their armor absorbing plasma fire with unnerving efficiency. Some carried weapons that shouldn't exist, railguns miniaturized to rifle size, plasma blades that burned with the same silver-purple hue as Vorthak power cores, made deadlier. Vorgel's mandibles clenched, seal the inner corridors, flood them with nerve, toxin. Gromnock hesitated. Their suits are filtering it, then burn them out. The order was futile. The humans had already breached 3 decks, their progress marked by the dying screams of Vorthak defenders. Security feeds showed glimpses of them, faceless behind blackened visors, moving like shadows. One paused, tilting its helmet toward a camera. For a heartbeat, Gromnock thought it was scanning the lens. Then it waved, the feed cut to static. Somewhere deep in the ship, a secondary reactor destabilized, its core overloading in a cascade of violet fire. The humans weren't just boarding, they were rewriting the ship's architecture, turning its own systems against it. Gromnock's tendrils coiled tight. This wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration, and the lesson was simple. You thought we were prey. We were never prey. The command deck shuddered as another explosion rippled through the Void Spike's lower decks. Vorgil's claws dug into the armrests of his throne, the polished metal groaning under the pressure. His secondary eyes flicked across the tactical display, red markers flaring, then vanishing as human boarding teams carved through his warriors like a blade through exposed flesh. Gromnock stood frozen beside him, his neural tendrils twitching in erratic pulses. The scientist had spent cycles studying the humans, their wars, their fractured histories, their crude but relentless innovations. He had compiled reports, dissected their strategies, and assured the High Command that their species was predictable. Now, the data feed scrolling before him told a different story. The humans weren't just fighting, they were teaching. Every corridor they seized, every system they hijacked, was another chapter in a brutal, unspoken lecture. Their tactics weren't improvised. They were archived, pulled from some dark repository of ancestral memory. They fought like the survivors of 1,000 lost battles, their movements too precise, their adaptations too fluid. A security feed flickered to life, revealing a human soldier, Captain Evan Reynolds, according to the stolen ident tags, standing amidst the wreckage of a Vorthak barricade. His armor was scorched, his visor cracked, but his posture was relaxed. Almost casual, he reached down, plucked a fallen warrior's pulse rifle from the deck, and turned it over in his hands. Then he modified it. Gromnock's breath hitched. The human's fingers moved with terrifying familiarity, rerouting power couplings, stripping safety protocols. In seconds, the weapon hummed with unstable energy, its barrel glowing violet, white. Reynolds tossed it to another soldier, who caught it without hesitation. They knew our tech, not just how to disable it, how to improve it. A new alert screamed across the display. The humans had breached the secondary armory. Vorgil snarled, mandibles flaring. Seal the blast doors. Trigger the feed dissolved into static as the armory's containment field failed. Not from an explosion, from something worse. Reconfiguration. The humans had jury, rigged the Vorthak's own weapon forges, turning them against their creators. Purple, white plasma, meant for ship, killing artillery, now snaked through the Void Spike's veins like poison. Bulkheads warped, circuits melted, not the quiet of surrender, the silence of a predator pausing mid-strike. Gromnock's tendrils coiled tight. The humans weren't just winning, they were curating. Every move, every butchered defense, was another entry in some grim living archive. A library written in blood and fire, its shelves lined with the corpses of those who had underestimated them. And the Vorthak had just become its newest volume section. Faye Vance's gambit, the silence stretched like a blade between ribs. Vorgil's claws flexed against the command console, the metal groaning under his grip. His secondary eyes flickered across the tactical display, where the Void Spike's internal schematics bled violet warnings. Whole sections of the ship had gone dark, not destroyed, not overtaken, but consumed. The humans had turned his own vessel into a labyrinth of their making, repurposing corridors into kill zones, weapon forges into traps. Gromnock's voice crackled through the calm, thin with something the Vorthak had no word for. Dread would have been too simple. This was colder, deeper. The unease of a scientist realizing his equations had birthed a monster. They're not just adapting, they're retrofitting, Vorgil snarled. He had seen the footage from the armory, how the humans had rerouted plasma conduits into the ventilation system, turning clean surgical Vorthak engineering into something jagged and brutal. Their tools were crude, welded scrap, jury, rigged explosives, but their intent was precise. Every move carved another lesson into the Void Spike's hull. You thought you knew war. You were wrong. A proximity alert shrieked. The humans were close now, too close. Vorgil's mandibles twitched as he activated the last line of defense. The Void Spike Sentinel drones, sleek silver killers designed to eviscerate boarders in seconds. They unfolded from their alcoves, blades humming with violet energy, and surged toward the breach point. For 3 glorious seconds, he allowed himself to believe it would be enough. Then the feeds died, not in a burst of static, not in the chaos of combat, but in perfect methodical sequence. One by one, the drones winked out. No explosions, no distress signals, just silence. And then the cameras reactivated. What they showed made Gromnock's tendrils coil so tight, they cracked his carapace. The drones were still there, but they weren't his anymore. The humans had done something unspeakable. Hacked, not just their systems, but their bodies. The drones' sleek silver frames were now studded with crude human modifications, reinforced plating, jury, rigged plasma cutters, their violet energy cores overclocked to a searing white, hot burn. And leading them, standing atop the foremost drone like some ancient warlord astride a conquered beast, was a human. Captain Evan Reynolds. His armor was scorched, his visor cracked, but his stance was relaxed, almost bored. As if this blasphemy against Vorthak engineering was just another Tuesday. Vorgel's blood ran cold, the human raised a hand, and the drones obeyed. They turned as one, their repurposed weapons humming, and leveled them not at the remaining Vorthak defenders, but at the Void Spike's primary reactor. Gromnock's voice was a whisper. "They're not trying to take the ship." Vorgel understood. The humans had never wanted conquest. They wanted a demonstration. And as the first plasma cutter flared to life, carving into the reactors, shielding with surgical precision, he realized they were going to make sure the Vorthak never forgot it. The reactor chamber pulsed with a dying rhythm, its silver-purple core flickering like a wounded beast. The air shimmered with heat distortion, the scent of scorched metal thick enough to taste. Vorgel's mandibles twitched, not in rage, not in defiance, but in something far worse. Understanding, the humans hadn't just boarded the Void Spike. They hadn't merely repurposed its drones, they had named them Gromnock's data. Pad trembled in his grip, the screen displaying the hacked drone network. Each unit bore an identifier, not the sterile alphanumerics of Vorthak command protocols, but human designations: Widowmaker, Old Ironsides, Hell's Grin. Names, not serials, not codes. Names. The realization struck Vorgel like a railgun round. The drones weren't tools to these creatures. They were warriors, honored, remembered. And that changed everything. The Vorthak Dominion had always prided itself on efficiency. Soldiers were assets. Ships were expendable. War was mathematics. Cold, precise, devoid of sentiment. But the humans, they fought like historians. Every scar on their armor was a story. Every weapon had a name, and names had weight. Across the chamber, Captain Reynolds stepped down from the commandeered drone, his boots clicking against the deck with deliberate calm. His cracked visor reflected the reactor's unstable glow, turning his gaze into something spectral. Vorgel's tactical instincts screamed at him to attack, to die well, but something deeper, something older, held him still. This wasn't just a battle, it was a lesson. The humans had clawed their way to dominance on a death world not through sheer brutality, but through something far more terrifying. Memory. They remembered every defeat, every loss, every weapon that had ever failed them. And they learned. Gromnock's voice was barely audible over the reactors. Death rattle, their databases. They don't just archive tactics, they archive stories. Vorgel's spine stiffened. Of Thermopylae, of Stalingrad, of the Black Summer, of a species that refused to die. The first plasma cutter bit deeper into the reactor shielding, molten alloy dripping like blood. Reynolds didn't flinch, he didn't gloat. He simply watched, his stance relaxed, as if this were inevitable. Because to him, it was. The Vorthak had come expecting savages. They'd found archivists, and archivists never forget. The reactor's death throes painted the command deck in jagged silver, purple light. The Vorthak's brutalist architecture, now a mausoleum flickering with the last gasps of its power core. Molten alloy dripped from the ceiling like metallic blood, hissing as it struck the deck. Vorgel's claws flexed against the armrests of his throne, the once imperious command chair now a cage. Across the ruined bridge, Reynolds stood silhouetted against the failing emergency lights, his posture loose, almost casual. The human didn't brandish his weapon, didn't sneer. He simply watched, as if this were a foregone conclusion, a historical echo, not a battle. Gromnock's data. Slate clattered to the deck, its screen still scrolling through the human archives. Not tactical briefings, not schematics, stories, the Battle of the Black Summer, the Siege of Eridani, names, dates, losses carved into their collective memory, like scars. The Vorthak had expected a species that fought with desperation, with rage. But these humans fought with something worse, precision. Every maneuver, every counterstrike, pulled from centuries of recorded defeats, refined into inevitability. A tremor rocked the ship as the plasma cutters breached the final reactor shielding. Alarms warbled, their cadence sluggish, like a dying beast's heartbeat. Vorgel's secondary eyelids flicked shut for a fraction of a second. A reflex, a moment of weakness when they opened. Reynolds had stepped closer, closer than had been a breath ago. The human moved like time itself had bent around him, effortless, inevitable. His armor was pocked with scorch marks. His visor cracked, but his breathing remained steady, controlled. Gromnock's voice was a rasp. They don't just learn from their own past, they learn from ours. The data slate's glow illuminated a recovered Vorthak transmission, an old war chant from the conquest of Carxes, a rallying cry, a weakness. Humans didn't just remember, they consumed. The deck lurched violently, throwing Vorgel forward. He caught himself on the throne's arm, the metal biting into his palm, across the chamber. Reynolds didn't stumble. He adjusted his footing with the ease of a man who'd stood on sinking ships before. The reactor's core flared, its silver-purple light turning sickly, unstable. Shadows stretched like grasping claws across the bulkheads. Somewhere deep in the ship's belly, the plasma cutters hit something vital. A sound like a dying star split the air. Vorgel's crest spines flattened against his skull. The humans hadn't just boarded his ship. They'd dissected it, and now, as the reactor's containment failed, as the light bled out of the world, he realized the truth too late. They hadn't come to conquer. They'd come to teach. The reactor's death scream shook the void claw to its bones. Vorgel's claws scraped against the throne's armrests, as the deck bucked beneath him, the metal groaning like a gutted beast. The air stank of ionized plasma and something fouler, burning insulation, molten alloy, the acrid tang of ruptured power conduits, the silver-purple glow of the core, once a symbol of Vorthak supremacy, now pulsed erratically, casting jagged shadows that slithered across the walls like living things. Across the command chamber, Reynolds stood motionless. His stance was loose, balanced. Not the rigid posture of a soldier braced for impact, but the easy readiness of a predator who had already won. His eyes, cold and calculating, never left Vorgel's face. The realization struck the High Commander like a railgun round. This wasn't a battle, it was a demonstration. The humans had torn through his ship not with brute force, but with surgical precision. They had mapped the Void Claw's veins, traced its arteries, found every weakness buried in its design. Weaknesses the Vorthak themselves had forgotten. They had turned his own technology against him, not by overpowering it, but by understanding it. And now, as the reactor's containment field flickered, as the deck plates shuddered with the promise of imminent collapse, Vorgel finally grasped the depth of his error. The humans had never been the prey. They had always been the hunters. A klaxon wailed, its shrill cry cutting through the chaos. Gromnock, the ship's chief scientist, staggered forward, his crest spines flared in panic. The core, it's destabilizing, The humans. They. His voice broke as he gestured to the holographic schematics flickering above the command console. The display showed the reactor's heart, its once orderly energy pathways now a tangled web of sabotage. Plasma cutters had carved through the failsafes. Viral code had rewritten the containment protocols. The humans hadn't just breached the ship. They had rewired it, turning its own systems into a countdown to annihilation. Vorgel's mandibles clenched. This wasn't warfare as the Vorthak knew it. This was something older, something worse. On the view screen, the human fleet held position, their ships silent and still. They weren't firing, they weren't advancing, they were watching, waiting for the lesson to sink in. The reactor's light flared again, brighter this time, its violet hue bleeding into an ugly irradiated white. The heat in the chamber spiked, sweat beading on Vorgel's exoskeleton. He had faced death before, in the conquest of Carxis, in the purging of the Vorthak nests. But this was different. This wasn't death with honor. This was death with purpose. Reynolds took a step forward, his boots clicking against the deck. "You thought we were weak," he said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "Because we bleed, because we grieve, because we remember." Another step. The reactor's whine climbed higher, the sound vibrating in Vorgel's bones. "But that's why you lost." The deck heaved, the lights failed. And in the darkness, Vorgel finally understood. The humans hadn't come to destroy the Void Claw. They had come to make sure the Vorthak never forgot it. The darkness lasted only a moment before the emergency luminescence flickered on, bathing the reactor chamber in a sickly silver-purple glow. The air smelled of scorched metal and ionized plasma, the reactor's containment field barely holding against the strain. Vorgel's mandibles twitched, his secondary eyes scanning the room, not for threats, but for patterns. The humans had stopped moving. They stood in perfect stillness, their weapons lowered but not holstered, their gazes locked onto the Vorthak commander with something that wasn't hatred. It was pity. Behind him, Gromnock's breathing was ragged, his claws flexing against the deck. The scientist had spent cycles dissecting human history, their wars, their rebellions, but he had never understood the core truth until now. They do not fight for conquest, they fight for survival, and survival, as the humans had proven time and again, was far more terrifying. A low hum resonated through the Voidclaw superstructure, the sound of failing systems, of a warship dying by inches. The reactor's containment field pulsed erratically, its violet light now streaked with jagged arcs of white, the color of a star's death throes. Vorgel's tactical implant screamed warnings, projecting schematics of the cascading failures. The humans had done this, not with brute force, not with overwhelming firepower, but with precision. A single strike to the right system, at the right time. And now the Voidclaw was bleeding out from the inside. Colonel Keller took a step forward, her expression unreadable. "You have a choice, Commander." Vorgel's spine stiffened. "There is no choice. The Vorthak do not surrender." Keller's lips thinned. "Not surrender. Adaptation." She gestured to the reactor, its light flickering like a dying heartbeat. "Your ship is dead. Your crew is alive. You can die here, pointlessly, or you can take this lesson back to your people." Gromnock made a choked sound. "You would let us leave?" Captain Reynolds exhaled, the ghost of a smile touching his face. "We're not you." The words struck deeper than any blade. Vorgel's mind raced. The Vorthak Empire had crushed 100 species beneath its heel, purged those who resisted, enslaved those who bowed. Mercy was a weakness. Retreat was a disgrace. The reactor groaned, a sound like a beast in agony. The deck trembled, a fine rain of dust shaking loose from the ceiling. The humans didn't flinch. They had done the math. They knew exactly how long they had, and they were waiting. Vorgel's claws flexed. For the first time in his life, the great conqueror hesitated. And in that hesitation, the galaxy shifted. The reactor's pulse was slowing. Vorgil could feel it in the deck beneath his claws. The staggered, arrhythmic thrum of a dying machine. The humans had not lied. Their ship was a corpse, its veins clogged with the last dregs of power, its heart stuttering toward silence. And yet, they stood there, unshaken, watching him with eyes that held no fear. Only expectation. Gromnock's breath came in short, ragged bursts beside him, his spines pressed flat against his skull in instinctive submission. The scientist had spent his life dissecting lesser species, measuring their worth in obedience and fragility. Now, he was seeing something else, something that should not exist. Humans did not break. They remembered. Vorgil's mandibles twitched. The weight of history pressed against him, sudden and suffocating. The Vorthak Empire had never lost a war. Not truly. Every battle was a lesson, every defeat a prelude to annihilation. Mercy was a myth. Retreat was unthinkable. Captain Reynolds shifted his stance, just slightly, his fingers resting near the sidearm at his hip. A silent reminder, not a threat, a choice. The humans had already won. They had known it before they ever set foot on this ship. The realization burned like plasma through Vorgil's veins. This was not a battle of weapons or shields. It was a trial of memory. The humans had clawed their way up from the dirt of a death world, had survived ice ages and wildfires, had stared into the abyss of extinction and laughed. They had built civilizations atop the bones of monsters, had forged empires from the wreckage of their own mistakes. And now they stood before him, offering him the one thing his people had never allowed their enemies. The reactor groaned again, a sound like a beast choking on its own blood. The lights flickered, shadows stretching long across the command deck. The humans remained still, their faces unreadable. Colonel Keller tilted her head just slightly, waiting. Vorgil's claws flexed. He had spent his life conquering. He had burned worlds, shattered fleets, erased entire species from the stars. He had believed, with absolute certainty, that the Vorthak were the pinnacle of strength. The humans had not needed to fire a single shot to prove him wrong. Gromnock made a sound, low and desperate. The scientist understood before Vorgil did. This was not surrender. This was evolution. The galaxy had shifted, and the Vorthak could either adapt. Vorgil exhaled, the weight of centuries pressing down on him. Then, slowly, he lowered his weapon. Epilogue. Carved in light, the war ended, not with fire, but with silence. The last Vorthak dreadnoughts powered down their weapons, their silver-purple energy cores dimming like dying stars. Across the battlefield, human ships held position, not in triumph, but in wary vigilance. Their hulls bore the scars of battle, blackened and pitted from plasma burns. Yet they remained. Unbroken, Vorgil stood on the observation deck of the Iron Resolve, the flagship of what had once been the Vorthak's unstoppable armada. The viewport stretched before him, framing the wreckage of his fleet like a graveyard of shattered steel. Some ships still burned, their cores hemorrhaging violet light into the void. Others drifted lifeless, their jagged silhouettes a testament to human ingenuity. He had expected annihilation. Instead, the humans had offered terms, not surrender, not subjugation. Behind him, the doors hissed open. He didn't need to turn to know who approached. The weight of the footsteps, the measured cadence, spoke louder than any announcement. Colonel Caroline Keller stepped beside him, her hands clasped behind her back. She didn't speak at first, her gaze fixed on the same devastation. The dim light of the stars painted her face in shades of blue and silver, etching the lines of exhaustion and resolve that even victory couldn't erase. Vorgil flexed his claws, the motion instinctive. A lifetime of conquest had taught him only one language: dominance or death. Yet here, now, the humans spoke in something else entirely. The word tasted bitter. "You could have destroyed us," he said at last, his voice a low rasp. Keller didn't look at him, Yes, a simple truth. The humans had outmaneuvered them, outfought them, outlasted them. Their weapons had been brutal, their tactics ruthless, but their final act had been restraint. Gromnak had called it madness. Vorgel called it something else. The galaxy would remember this day, not as the fall of the Vorthak, but as the moment humanity carved their name into the stars, not with blades, but with light. Keller finally turned her head, studying him. "You're wondering why?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She exhaled, a sound almost like amusement. "We've spent our entire history fighting monsters. Some of them were ours, some of them weren't." Her eyes flicked to the distant wreckage. "But we learned one thing." Vorgel waited. "The strongest predators," she said softly, "know when not to strike." Silence settled between them, thick with understanding. Outside, the stars burned on, indifferent, and the galaxy shifted.